Good afternoon, everybody. Certainly, we've had a wonderful week with the lectures that Professor Glaude has presented. I want to say I think there may be a Spelman-Morehouse coup underway because yesterday afternoon, Brother Ron Sullivan introduced Eddie Glaude as a fellow Morehouse alum, and I get to introduce him now as a Spelman alum. Although I don't have nearly as many juicy stories to tell because they were both at Morehouse long before I ever showed up in the AUC. So I can't reminisce with them about those moments. But it has been a true pleasure and privilege of mine to get to know Eddie since graduate school, and to really learn from him. His great intellectual prowess is something that we all celebrate. Eddie Glaude is the chair of the Center of African American Studies and the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University. He is also a founding member and senior fellow of the Jamestown Project at Harvard University. A specialist in the fields of religion, ethics, and politics, Glaude offers a critical and insightful view on the problems currently facing Black America, as well as the nation at large. He is the author of several books, including Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation in the Early 19th Century, Black America, which won the Modern Language Association's William Saunders Scarborough Book Prize, and the author of In a Shade of Blue. He's also the editor of Is It Nation Time, as well as African American Religious Studies, an anthology, a book which I often use in my classes. Eddie's born in Moss Point, Mississippi, which he talked extensively about last night in his section on the heroic. And tonight we're looking forward to his ongoing discussion of the democratic as he finalizes his lecture series, Pragmatic, Reconstructions, the Prophetic, the Heroic, and the Democratic. Let's welcome Eddie Glaude.
Thank you, Marla, for that gracious introduction. Skip, you almost brought tears to my eyes because I was thinking about my great-grandmother, Ruby Wilson. And we used to go to her house, and the refrigerator, which had, we would call it the ice box, which had the best Kool-Aid in the world in it, and the stove, which had the best pinto beans in the world on it. She bought both of them with her pension plan, which was dimes that she got being a domestic in the house of white folks on the coast of Mississippi. And Ruby would say to me right now that, boy, you in high cotton. And I'm just going to call her name, right, as an honor, because as you say that about me, it's really about those extraordinary people who made me possible. So thank you, and thanks to Harvard. Thank you all who've shared in this journey with me over the last 2 days. So here we go. Let's bring it home. On democracy and Ella Baker. So on April 16th, 1960, in Raleigh, North Carolina at Shaw University, students who had participated in lunch counter sit-ins throughout the South gathered to found what would become the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The founding conference had been organized by Ella Baker, executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Baker, a seasoned organizer, sought to bring Black student activists together to enable them to, quote, share experience gained in recent protest demonstrations and to help chart future goals for effective action, end quote. She would hold off attempts by Dr. King and others to absorb the energy of the students and to establish civil rights organizations and provide space for the voicing of a different kind of politics, a different kind of Black politics rooted in the democratic energy of young students who dared to challenge directly Jim Crow. Baker believed, and she enacted this belief in the very way she organized, that what the Black freedom struggle needed most, what America needed most, was, quote, the development of people who are interested not in being leaders as much as in developing leadership among other people, end quote. She had come to understand that the model of leadership represented by Dr. King and the gaggle of preachers around him inclined people to a kind of hero worship, which blinded them to their own capacities and responsibilities. Baker voiced then a deep-seated suspicion of the work of charismatic leadership, not to deny its productive potential, because after all, she was a charismatic figure of sorts, but to be mindful of how charisma can short-circuit democratic energies. Quote, instead of the leader as a person who was supposed to be a magic man, she argued, you could develop individuals bound together by a concept that benefited the larger numbers and provided an opportunity for them to grow into being responsible for carrying out a program, end quote. The challenge was to help others develop their own unique selves and to bring to the fore their potential as problem-solving agents. As Baker noted, quote, my basic sense of it has always been to get people to understand that in the long run, they themselves are the only protection they have against violence or injustice. People have to be made to understand that they cannot look for salvation anywhere but to themselves. I want to say that sentence again. Right. People have to be made to understand that they cannot look for salvation anywhere but to themselves. Now, this realization depends upon encounters through critical participation that can generate self-trust, and self-trust enables collective efforts among the most unlikely of agents to transform unjust conditions. Now, this view undermines fundamentally traditional modes of prophetic and heroic leadership that condition us to look through the eyes of others. Instead, we can come to hold the view, as Emerson insisted in an exquisite riff on the parable of talents, quote, that though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him, but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground, which is given to him to till, end quote. So Baker commends a view of leadership commensurate with my efforts, at least this is a bloomy and strong reading, my efforts to reconstruct our understanding of the prophetic and the heroic. She put the point quite powerfully. Check out this quotation. I've been working through her papers, and this sister is just blowing me away, right? In political life, I've always felt it was a handicap for oppressed peoples to depend so largely upon a leader. Because unfortunately in our culture, the charismatic leader usually becomes a leader because he's found a spot in the public limelight. It usually means he has been touted through the public media, which means that the media made him, and the media may undo him. There's also the danger in our culture that because a person is called upon to give public statements and is acclaimed by the establishment, such a person gets to the point of believing that he is the movement. Such people get so involved with playing the game of being important that they exhaust themselves and their time, and they don't do the work of actually organizing people, end quote. Now, Baker makes several points in this rather complex formulation. First, obviously, she notes the pitfalls of black leadership in a media age, right? Baker's organizing preceded the advent of mass media in some ways, right? She worked in the bowels of the South, organizing membership drives for the NAACP, when joining the organization could actually get you beaten up or killed, quote unquote, right? Obviously, the television cameras and their role in direct action campaigns impacted and in some cases changed the very nature of organizing. Second, in this passage, Baker expresses how the ascendance of media-driven leadership actually undermines mechanisms of accountability. Cameras and coverage become the arbiters of who leads and who doesn't. Here one can see the residual trace of Du Bois's worry about Booker T. Washington, not so much the concern over Washington's white patrons, but the very way his ascendance to leadership short-circuited accountability. Remember, Du Bois wrote this, right? Honest and earnest criticism from those whose interests are most nearly touched, criticism of writers by readers, of government by those governed, of leaders by those led. This is the soul of democracy and the safeguard of modern society, end quote. In some ways, Baker's channeling that worry about Washington that was evident in Du Bois's souls. And finally, Baker's suspicion about the negative work of charisma is clearly evident in this passage. And it's bound up with the culture of celebrity that media makes possible, as my colleague Joshua Glaude made mention to me last night. Charisma can easily become the value, as opposed to a means to an organizing end. The charismatic figure can become the end itself, and the result, for example, in someone like Dr. King, becoming the embodiment of the movement. Now, that was a footnote, so it can be fleshed out over the course of conversation. So our attention must turn from the glare of the supposed gifts of the prophet and hero towards the cultivation of dispositions requisite for genuine democratic life. For Baker, each of us has a moral imagination. Each of us can, in fact, no matter our material circumstances, engage in reflective efforts to reach beyond the challenges, constraints of the current moment, and to grasp undisclosed opportunities that can, without guarantee, fundamentally upend the order of things and make possible new ideals and ends. We do not need, quote unquote, the prophet or, quote unquote, the hero for this. All we need, and this is not always self-evident, is ourselves. At least this is how I understand Baker's famous dictum, strong people, quote, don't need strong leaders, end quote. The cultivation of self-trust, resulting in a robust sense of individuality within community, becomes the basis of democratic collective action and allows for multitudes of prophetic and heroic moments. I want to offer a reading of Baker that extends the reach of my peculiar embrace of pragmatism. Of course, as I mentioned in the first lecture, my view is indebted to Cornel West's understanding of prophetic pragmatism. West has it right when he says that a consequence of the Emersonian evasion of philosophy is a culture of creative democracy where, quote, politically adjudicated forms of knowledge are produced in which human participation is encouraged and for which human personalities are enhanced, end quote. What was once the purview of philosophers now becomes the work of each of us. And for West, quote, the populace deliberating is creative democracy in the making, end quote. This does not mean that professional elites are always the object of scorn or that mob rule is the order of the day. Rather, as West writes, quote, it is the citizenry in action with its civil consciousness molded by participation in public interest, centered in individual rights regarding democracy, end quote. So prophetic pragmatism for him thematizes the political implications of the Emersonian swerve. It yokes pragmatism more closely to the philosophy of John Dewey by insisting that it be understood as a form of cultural criticism and that its idea of politics makes central the experiences of everyday ordinary people. I've resonated with this view ever since I first heard it as a graduate student. And anybody knows me knows that Cornell's hands are all over me. But I remain suspicious of the Christian undertow of my dear friend's use of the word prophetic. Perhaps it is the ghost of Kierkegaard that haunts West's embrace of pragmatism and leads him to ask certain questions that I simply believe are best left aside. Now, in my first lecture, I sought to read the prophetic in a romantic register, shorn of its romance with genius and released from its indebtedness to the Hebrew prophets. My aim was to locate the prophetic in the very exercise of critical intelligence, to see it as the work of the moral imagination, envisioning beyond the immediate. It was and is a leveling impulse, evidenced in the second lecture in my efforts to think of the heroic in terms of representativeness, rooted in vulnerability and wound, an idea that brings us all into its orbit as the occasion may arise for each of us to exhibit such quality. My intention has been, and it remains, to insist on those conditions that enable us to step out from under the shadows in order to address creatively, imaginatively, the challenges of our day and voices uniquely our own. My worry about West's use of the prophetic beyond its supplemental function, given his attribution of anemia to pragmatism, is that it threatens to undo the insight, that the prophet's voice all too often drowns out the deliberating populace, and simply calls us to drop our spades and to follow him. Much more is required in the pursuit of worthwhile ends and in the cultivation of capacities for the exercise of deliberative and practical reasoning. I want to read Baker as an exemplar of prophetic pragmatism shorn of the anxieties that haunt its initial articulations. Her life's witness helps me reconstruct what we might mean when we invoke the phrase, and more importantly, it makes explicit a view of democratic perfectionism at the heart of the philosophy. Of course, as Barbara Ramsby notes, quote, Baker never wrote an organizing manual or an ideological treatise. Her theory was literally inscribed in her daily work, her practice, end quote. Now, to my mind, this is precisely the strength of Baker's view. It is tested in the context of lived experiences and in the light of actual problems faced. Hers is a view that cannot be accused of failing to take seriously the operations of power, precisely because it was developed and enacted in the throes of power's exercise. In this sense, Baker's pragmatism escapes some of the concerns about pragmatism more generally, that it is naive about self-interest and corporate power, or more generally blind to the agonistic dimensions of democratic life. Now, Ransby reaches for theoretical frames elsewhere to account for Miss Baker's philosophy. Antonio Gramsci, C.L.R. James, and Paulo Freire, right, help her make sense of the radically democratic thrust of Baker's practice. But I want to suggest that Ms. Baker's insistence on the capacities and responsibilities of everyday ordinary people and her tireless work on behalf of what I take to be creative democracy is actually best understood in pragmatist terms. Now, 3 slogans will guide my efforts to read Ms. Baker as a prophetic pragmatist. One is a chastened voluntarism, a chastened voluntarism. The other is a morally motivated experimentalism. And lastly is a view of democracy as an ethical way of life. So the first is a chastened voluntarism, the second is a morally motivated experimentalism, and the last is a view of democracy as a way of life, ethical way of life. Now, at the heart of Baker's philosophy rests what I've called a chastened voluntarist impulse that informs her militant egalitarianism. I say chastened because Baker, like James Baldwin, fully understood that human capacities take shape in life worlds that often dash dreams and deny individuals dignity and standing, contexts that socialize individuals into doubting themselves and their abilities. Baldwin's words about his brother in The Fire Next Time come to mind, right? And I know, which is much worse, and this is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I, nor time, nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it, end quote. So Baker's is not a view of Promethean powers deployed in a romantic act of self-creation. Instead, hers is a jazz-inflected view that the very reach for a higher self entails a struggle not simply with the dangers of conformity, but with the conditions that block the way to our understanding of who we can be and what we are capable of. The primacy of human will in practice remains, but shadowed by the persistence of evils that often frustrate our self-realization. The task is to develop one's unique talents within community and to understand those talents as gifts capable of transforming the circumstances of one's living. Baker insists on the value of each human being and their ability, if acknowledged and cultivated, to contribute to making a better world. Now, this is not a position of an undifferentiated mass. It is a naturalized understanding of the dignity and worth of each individual and the sanctity of their capacity to do good. And of course, there's some church back there, but we can unpack that in the course of dialogue. So Baker's militant egalitarianism stands alongside her morally motivated experimentalism. Her practice involved efforts to select future experience with the understanding of the possibility of error when we act. Nothing was settled beforehand, and what was required was a willingness to experiment, to tinker, with the understanding that the future was implicated in the present. In this light, ideals were pursued in the context of receptive practice close to the ground. I'm going to return to this phrase later on. But receptive practice close to the ground. She encouraged listening, adjusting, and adapting in the pursuit of collectively shared ends. As the political theorist Raman Coles notes, quote, Baker sought to cultivate a profound openness to experience on the part of organizers she helped to train. A strong sense that this chief quality that they themselves should seek to practice and engender in their efforts to organize radical democratic communities of struggle, end quote. Openness to experience placed in the foreground the necessity of process or method. For Baker, the ends for which they struggled required a similar commitment to the means by which those ends would be attained. Now, this is a critical point. If the means by which we seek a more expansive democratic life are in fact authoritarian, the seeds of the undoing of any good are present from the very beginning. Means matter. Otherwise, those who fight for good today turn out to be the tyrants of tomorrow. Processes that are liberating today end up tightening the vice grip of our domination. Baker insisted that democratic and participatory values be the basis of black political struggle precisely for this reason. And John Dewey stated the point succinctly in a message read before the first public meeting of the Committee for Cultural Freedom in 1939. Quote, "If there is one conclusion," and this is ironic that he's saying this to the Committee for Cultural Freedom, right? "If there is one conclusion to which human experience unmistakably points, it is that democratic ends demand democratic methods for their realization. An American democracy can serve the world only as it demonstrates in the conduct of its own life the efficacy of plural, partial, and experimental methods in securing and maintaining an ever-increasing release of the powers of human nature in the service of a freedom which is cooperative and a cooperation which is voluntary," end quote. For Baker, as for Dewey, again, the ends for which we struggle require similar commitment to the means by which those ends are attained. As Dewey stated in, quote, stated in an article entitled "Democracy is Radical," the fundamental principle of democracy is that the ends of freedom and individuality for all can be attained only by the means that accord with those ends, something redundant. Otherwise, we end up with tyrants dismissive of democratic virtue or browbeating moralists who treat most like the herd. So Baker rejected top-down models of leadership and encouraged a patient, inclusive, deliberative process that embodied the militant egalitarianism noted above. Each voice was valued. Every thought warranted recognition and attention. As SNCC organizer Mary King put it, quote, "We had a stern insistence that our conceptualization, our thinking, our framework should grow from engagement with the people that we were working with rather than from doctrine or any ready-made philosophy," end quote. Or as Barbara Jones recalled, quote, "There was no room for talking down to anyone. There was never the expressed attitude that a person who was illiterate had something less to offer," end quote. An openness to the possibilities inherent in experience characterized their practice. As Coles puts the point powerfully, at the heart of this form of organizing were, quote, "quotidian rituals engendering individual and collective cultivation of responsive democratic character," end quote. Finally, Baker's understanding of democracy as an ethical way of life and how it informs her organizing shaped her prophetic pragmatism, or what I'm calling her prophetic pragmatism. For her, democracy is more than a body of procedures and certainly is not reducible to the principles of liberalism. Instead, democracy carries with it the radical notion that every individual, no matter his or her station in life, was and is capable of exercising responsibility, a responsibility that's not reducible to procedures, right, and election cycles, right? Democracy on this view is an ethical ideal bound up with the particular idea of self-cultivation, democratic perfectionism, and rooted in, quote, "a faith in the capacities of human beings for intelligent judgment and action if the proper conditions are furnished," end quote. Individuals need only be empowered through education to look within themselves and to their experiences with others to grasp fully ideas of value that orient them to social and political realities. I recall a recent conversation with Bob Moses, the famed SNCC organizer. Bob couldn't make it tonight because we at Princeton, we're sponsoring the board meeting of the Algebra Project right now, so he's had to fly back. And I've been learning so much from him, even when he's not talking, which is most of the time. Right. Moses insisted that the revolutionary work of SNCC resided not simply in its efforts to dismantle Jim Crow, but principally in who they brought into the political process. He tells a story of SNCC field secretaries in a federal courtroom in Greenwood, Mississippi, quote, "packed with black sharecroppers, hushed along its walls, packed onto its benches, and attending to the question put by Federal District Judge Clayton, 'Why is SNCC taking illiterates down to register to vote?' end quote. Those illiterate black sharecroppers brought with them to that courthouse and to the ballot box a wealth of experience that shaped their demands of the state, informed their embrace of democratic ideals, and expanded, if only for a moment, our very understanding of who we take ourselves to be as a nation. Moses, like Baker, understood that genuine moral democracy called not only for the pursuit of worthwhile ends, but, quote, for the pursuit of the ends in ways that enlisted the freely cooperative participation of all concerned, end quote. The language is Dewey's. But his words are given added depth and power, I believe, in Baker's prophetic pragmatism. Dewey held the belief that democracy understood as an ethical ideal entails the deliberate work of forging bonds of association in such a way that the capacities and powers of every individual are realizable in full participation in political and cultural life. Democracy extends beyond the mere exercise of public reason. It's not just about deliberating with our fellows about important matters or participation in elections informed by a flood of talk, but rather democracy requires a richly textured democratic culture close to the ground, where the habits and dispositions necessary for its flourishing are alive in the experiences of everyday ordinary folk. Much of American life frustrated these ends, from the destabilizing currents of rapid modernization that, quote, dislocated and unsettled local communities, end quote, to the attitudes and practices rooted in white supremacy and patriarchy that often, quote, made shambles of American democracy, end quote. What was needed, required even under such conditions, were innovative and creative ways of revitalizing local communities and fostering, quote, the development of multiple publics where citizens could engage in debate and deliberation together. And in the paper, I have sick by citizens. Baker's radical democratic philosophy entailed what I want to call her networked democratic localism, a networked democratic localism. The phrase is a bit awkward, but I think it captures the approach to democratic politics based in encounters in local multiple publics. Such encounters expanded possibility through critical participation in challenging Jim Crow and in the cultivation of democratic dispositions and habits among those who struggle together. But this view should not be read as conceding the national political terrain to others. The invocation of localism was not necessarily to deny the relevance of the national scene, although it certainly marked suspicion about that scene. Instead, local practices entered into a network of local practices elsewhere that together had national implications. Just as Ella Baker's NAACP organizing took her all over the South, establishing pathways, connections, and conduits that connected her practice across geographies, a more generalized understanding of democratic localism presumed the circulation of local practices and effects along a network of efforts to address particular problems in light of specific situations. Remember what SNCC stands for. It is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, all right? Collectively, such efforts constituted loosely a national thrust. Separately, the substance of the practice was evidenced in this receptive orientation close to the ground, right? Now, I agree with Barbara Ramsby when she says that Baker's, quote, political praxis reflected a deliberative model. Interaction, she goes on to write, discussion, debate, and consensus building were key components of that practice. In contrast, voting, lobbying, the corridors of power, and getting favorite candidates elected were secondary considerations, end quote. But Ramsey doesn't identify the perfectionist, the democratic perfectionist strand of Baker's localism, that her practice entailed a radical commitment to the cultivation of democratic individuality in the service of justice. As such, Baker's politics cannot be contained by a deliberative model alone. Much more is going on. The emergence of an indigenous cadre of leaders capable of finding salvation in and for themselves, and by extension, a wholesale assault on a particular model of black leadership that resists accountability by what is perceived as an undifferentiated mass. Baker's practice involved then aspirational claims, i.e. about what kind of society we hope to live in and what kinds of persons we aspire to be, as well as claims rooted in care about the historical depth of where we now stand. That is, about the enduring legacy of white supremacy that deforms self-formation and about the history of struggle that constitutes the backdrop of current efforts. Baker's democratic perfectionism is situated in the histories of black life. Stories that narrate the litany of events and the chorus of black voices struggling for freedom and resisting domination or the arbitrary use of power. These histories carry with them an ethical ought that the struggle and sacrifices of so many require of those who are its immediate beneficiaries, a commitment to treating one's fellows justly and to ensuring a society where all can flourish. To act otherwise is to risk the label of race traitor. Invocations of that history can spur or constrain. They can serve as the wind beneath our wings in the context of creative engagement with the present, or they can limit the range of actions to a stale, ossified set of practices that purportedly best represent our efforts. Baker's situated democratic perfectionism commended the former, just as she resisted efforts to absorb the student movement into older, established civil rights organizations. Baker insisted on the space for the young people of SNCC to find their own voice and to make their unique contribution to a tradition of struggle. The citation of the past in this instance, not a nostalgia for origins, gave shape and contour to their imaginings. It did not deform and distort. Now, Baker's attentiveness to the cultivation of democratic dispositions, among the least of these, is best described following Sheldon Wolin as a politics of tending. As Wolin writes, the idea of tending, quote, is one that centers politics around practices, that is, around the habits of competence or skill that are routinely required if things are to be taken care of, end quote. He goes on to say, quote, that tending is tempered by the feeling of concern for objects whose nature requires that they be treated as historical and biographical beings. The beings are such as to need regular attention from someone who is concerned about well-being and is sensitive to historical needs, end quote. Imagination as an act of sympathy is central to the politics of tending in that it opens us up to the wounds and joys of others, enables habit formation that affirms the dignity of our fellows, and encourages a willingness to embrace those receptive practices of listening and of being still as critical features of a mode of democratic struggle. Tending, then, gathers politics around rooted and knotted practices, doings and sufferings that evidence habits and dispositions forged over a life lived. To be open to such experience is to tend to roughly hewn hands that mark a life of toil, to bloodshot eyes that signal too much drink, to raucous laughter that offer a glimpse of the depths of joy, and to tend to the blank stare that reveals either defeat or possibility. Tending can be expressed in Ella Baker's powerful question, even when memories have long faded. Who your people? The question subverts a sociology, as Ralph Ellison would put it, that reduces the depth of experience to flat statistics of pathology by seeking an account of love and wound that constitute the ground beneath one's feet and the conditions of possibility for a higher self. Now, I don't want to assimilate Baker's view wholly into Wolin's deep suspicion of constitutionalism, that the very idea of representation in the form of the federal state constitutes the capture of democratic energies. To be sure, Wolin posits a politics of tending over and against what he calls a politics of intending. And he does so in the context of disrupting how we remember, and in this instance, how we celebrated the bicentennial of the Constitution. A politics of tending, to put the point crudely, represents an anti-federalist position, while a politics of intending reflect the impulses and efforts of the likes of Madison and Hamilton. Federalists aspire, on Wolin's view, for a form of authority that obscures the richly textured practices of the local. They hide from view an active political life which preceded the effort to stretch localities into a wider constellation of federal power and into the idea of the citizen that power required. Following de Tocqueville, Wolin understands these local practices as the lifeblood of American democratic culture. It is here, in the intimate space of the local, what I've been calling close to the ground, that Americans acquire the habits, values, and dispositions requisite for democratic life, where, quote, democratic citizenship is a process of becoming, not an already established fact. Now, of course, for much of African American history, the local has also been the site of terror. For many who embraced the sanctity of the local, many of those anti-federalists also defended white supremacy with a vengeance. But even with this different register, Wolin's general point still holds, that democracy consists in the dispersal of power and our experiences with that power. It's not reducible to a form of government, and our efforts are not limited to petitioning the seats of power or storming the White House. As Wolin writes in Fugitive Democracy, quote, democracy is not about where the political is located, but about how it is experienced. Revolutions activate the demos and destroy boundaries that bar access to political experience. Individuals from the excluded social strata take on responsibilities, deliberate about goals and choices, and share in decisions that have broad consequences and effect unknown and distant to others. This revolutionary transgression is the means by which the demos makes itself political." End quote. It is in the very experience of racial terror, in the back-breaking labor disciplines of the cotton field, in the reality of de jure segregation, the literal direct experience with power, that politics as usual are dispensed with, and the political is evidenced in a particular kind of democratic possibility colored a deep shade of blue. Baker understood this profoundly, and without talking or taking on the claim of fugitive democracy, right? Like Wolin, she advocated for and enacted the development of democratic practices at the local level, informed by the historicity of place and the complexity of the actors involved. What comes into view here is not simply the operations of state power, obviously that is readily seen, but the formation of particular kinds of dispositions in confrontation with the operations of power. To insist on the capacities and responsibilities of everyday ordinary people, to urge that they reach for a higher self under conditions of capture, is to give democratic perfectionism a radical inflection. For Wolin, quote, "Democracy requires that the experiences of justice and injustice serve as moments for the demos to think, to reflect perchance, to construct themselves as actors." That perchance references Hamlet, right? To give you the sense of the darkness behind Wolin's position, right? But for Baker, such moments occasion an opportunity to expand the very idea of who matters in the demos. And in the context of struggle with others, an occasion to construct a vision of ourselves as agents and again as saviors. I'm coming home. Thank you, Pastor. Nothing I've said contradicts how Cornel West understands prophetic pragmatism. He readily admits that the commitments of the prophetic pragmatists, quote, to individuality and democracy, historical consciousness and systematic social analysis, and tragic action in an evil-ridden world can take place in, though on the margins of a variety of traditions, end quote. He simply chooses to find his feet as a prophetic pragmatist, though as of late he has jettisoned the label, in the Christian tradition, as seen in his recent decision to return to the faculty of Union Theological Seminary. In some ways, I lost a father again. That tradition provides him with existential comfort in the face of the absurd, his Kierkegaardian anxiety, and it enables an organic connection with the wretched of the earth who, as he puts it, are deeply religious. And I should say that I have no qualms with West's personal assent to Christian stories. I assent to those same stories. I only worry that the model of leadership he implicitly embraces, one seemingly indebted to the role of the preacher, and the way the prophetic sometimes cashes out in the preacher's hands, actually subverts under present conditions the more egalitarian premises he sets forth. Baker's prophetic pragmatism, I believe, evades this problematic. Hers is not rooted in the mode of the preacher, but in the labor of the many women who made the church possible. To accent her situated democratic perfectionism offers, for me at least, resources for striking the right balance between piety and self-creation, and marks a pathway to step out of the shadows of a black moralism that denies imaginative and representative action. Now the backdrop, and I'm coming home, the backdrop of my reading of Baker's pragmatism is the ascendance of a particular form of black custodial politics. This politics collapses the complexity of black life into an undifferentiated mass in need of representation by a particular black political class. It also short-circuits the need for substantive deliberation and banishes mechanisms of accountability as black elites broker on behalf of black constituencies whose interests are, so it would seem, readily identifiable. The effect is the demobilization of black democratic energies that results in a kind of non-participatory politics as black folk every election cycle are treated as the herd and as some grab megaphones, more than likely on MSNBC, to speak for them. Yeah, I said that.
That's cold.
I know. The story of black custodial politics is a complex one. Briefly, it begins with the effects of slavery and Jim Crow in constraining the very way black politics is imagined, placing an idea of collective interest and representation of those interests at the heart of its practice. We can trace that out. We can see it in the transformation of black politics in the aftermath of the black freedom struggles of the 1960s and 70s and the ascendance of a particular black political class and how that class functions, and culminates in the neoliberal consolidation of a particular regime of black representation with the election of Barack Obama. Obviously, to include President Obama in this story is a provocative claim, and I don't have the space to vindicate it here. But following Adolph Reed, I want to suggest that with the reduction of civil rights activism into the iconography of Dr. King, with this federal holiday and now with the memorial in D.C., the impact of Jesse Jackson's presidential bids in 1984 and 1988, and with the election of President Obama in 2008, what we have witnessed is the most radical narrowing of African-American political action to date, end quote, in which the totality of black political concerns seem bound up with the relative success or failure of Obama's presidency. Alongside this narrowing of political action, in fact, it enables it, in my view, is a moralist narrative of black struggle that works either to discipline dissent or serves as a justification for criticism of the president's purported failures. And beneath the arguments and all of the vitriol, to paraphrase my friend Bob Moses, lies all of this rot. I asked the question in my second lecture, what if the fire drake, the very condition for the possibility of heroic action, has slipped from view, and we're left with black bourgeois aspirational claims standing in for all black politics? I now see that the question actually contained its answer. The fire drake has now become, and perhaps it has always been, that very politics where the uniqueness of black selves is lost in the representative claims of a select few who perhaps unwittingly deepen white supremacy's hold on our very understanding of democracy. What is needed now, especially in this moment, is an insistence of the uniqueness of our own voices together, not as a form of adolescent individualism consonant with the procedures of neoliberalism, but as the hard work of a kind of situated perfectionism that deepens democratic life. What is needed for us together is to break the hold of the prophets and heroes of old on our imaginations and to usher in a different way of thinking and doing black politics. And that different way, of course, will be indebted to the past, which, of course, prophesies this new and different enunciation. In a recent lecture at Harvard Law School, Bob Moses talked about, among other things, what he called earned insurgencies. Isn't that an elegant phrase? Earned insurgencies, that the students of SNCC had done the requisite work close to the ground to garner the respect of black farmers and sharecroppers such that they were willing to risk their lives alongside them, not behind them. SNCC had, quote, earned the issues they placed on the national table, Moses writes. They had, quote, summoned up human dignity to confront psychological contempt, economic deprivation, and deadly physical assault, end quote. Earned insurgency is an extraordinary consequence of a politics of tending, of that receptive practice characteristic of Ella Baker's prophetic pragmatism, in which trust, courage, commitment, and love, rooted in caring struggle, animate a willingness to risk everything and a practice that cultivates the capacities of all involved. Ella Baker's prophetic pragmatism calls each of us to a higher self, in which our unique talents are deployed in the service of justice. For her, the distinctiveness of who we are isn't lost in an overarching narrative of struggle with its attendant heroes, nor is it collapsed into some tenuous idea of black interests represented by some black prophet or black leader. Instead, the richness and complexity of where I stand with others becomes the place from which a better world is imagined. And to be sure, we all have that capacity to imagine a world beyond the horror of now, to implicate a future in the very way we earn our insurgency, and stand up heroically to the darkness of the current hour. Thank you.
Comments, is it on? Mm-hmm. Can you hear me? Okay. What about the fact that the I mean, you're presupposing, you used the term twice, I think, maybe 3 times, but I think twice, of the undifferentiated mass of black people, right? And in a critical way. But would someone be justified in asking you, if you're implicitly presupposing a unified community of interest among 40 million people self-identified as being of African descent, in light of the fact that the principal effect of affirmative action since that terrible day Martin Luther King was killed has been the creation of 2 distinct self-perpetuating classes within the black community on a scale, to a degree, unprecedented in the history of the Negro. The black middle class, on the one hand, has quadrupled since 1968, but the percentage of black children living at or beneath the poverty line the day King was killed was 38%. What is it today? 36%, 35%, 37%.
Those who are on the edge of poverty jumps that number even higher.
So, and according to many social scientists in private, never the twain shall meet. Never. That we will be remembered as the generation that presided over the permanent class divide within the African American community. So, in light of these economic facts, how does your analysis, it sounds beautiful.
Thank you.
But how real is
high
it?
Praise.
How real is it politically?
I think it's actually, the political is actually what's motivating it, precisely because those divisions are often elided and obscured in the very ways in which black politics take shape on the national scene. So there's an idea, so you're saying that there's an irony in the heart in which, at the heart of the way in which I'm trying to deconstruct how black interests motivate black politics, by presupposing that there's something like black interest that's being misrepresented. Is that a...
No, I'm saying that on some issues, if the Klan would announce they're going to kill, 50 black men a month, 40 million black people be united to kick the Klan's ass. But there are all kinds of ways that the black community, quote, does not exist as a community of interest.
Absolutely.
If we vote for president, we all vote the same way. And if it's black man, we're going to vote 90, no matter what is happening, we're going to vote for that person. But I'm thinking about, you're giving this lecture series, it wasn't intentional, but with the passing of the torch. You're doing that, you're reading your mentor, and he's leaving you. And subsequent intellectual historians will comment on your book and this moment of your critique of Cornell leaving Princeton. It's just an accident of history. It's been quite fascinating for me to sit here and watch it and think about it over, I mean, you couldn't have staged it better. It took us a lot to pay Cornell to announce this.
That's my man right there.
Lead to sales.
Yeah, right here.
But it's conceivable that there will be many more issues. There already are issues where black people do not define their primary interests in relationship to each other. Politically. Right? And when you add the immigrant factor that you face at Princeton, we face at Harvard, which has led to my shock, a lot of tensions among our undergraduates between the African American and the recent African American community. I mean, I don't even want to factor that in. I'm just saying we are at a crossroads.
Absolutely.
And your exhortation, which it was, ends with presupposing that the talented 10th will lead, or that the community will come back, or that somehow our deep spirituality will be rekindled, and we will remind ourselves that we are a people, and that we will keep the community together. And the question is, will the notion of a black community, quote unquote, become a quaint remnant of the past 20 years from now? Well, and is it already?
Well, I hope I wasn't making that last claim, right? And if so, then I wasn't clear. And the background to this work, obviously, is the last chapter of In a Shade of Blue, where I'm talking. It's entitled "The Eclipse of a Black Public," where I make the argument explicit that these sorts of claims about black interest must be thrown into the mess of politics and have to be deliberated among competing interests among black folk, that solidarities are made. They come in and out of existence all the time and cannot be presupposed. That identities, in fact, are the consequences of action, they don't precede and determine action, right? So the ideas of black loyalty, the ideas of black piety that typically animate a certain understanding of black politics, I've already kind of called into question. That's the first point. The second point is that, but how this, remember one of the things that's really striking, what is the right relation between piety, wound, and self-creation? How do we understand our relation to a past that defines very loosely a sense of connectedness between some of us?
Sure.
Right?
And you and I make our living in our different ways, chairing or directing institutions.
Programs that do.
You know, we make our business trying to keep that idea alive.
Right. And so for me, all of this has to take place in the context of the messiness of politics. But it can't. Right. What you're describing is a reality that we have to deal with in the context of addressing particular problems faced. And we can't wash over it by just simply appealing to some ready-at-hand notion of solidarity as a basis of mobilizing constituents. Right. So in the midst of, say, a curricular question on a school board, right? We just can't presume that because we're all black, we're gonna go walk up in that joint together and do X, Y, and Z. We actually have to get down, do the work of mobilizing constituencies, and do it in such a way that in the process of addressing the school board, we're cultivating dispositions such that they're not deferring to organizers or leaders, but see themselves as the persons who are engaging in the transformative practice. So part of what I'm suggesting is that the complexity that you're describing has to be addressed in a way that doesn't presume a ready-made connectedness or connection. It doesn't presume that interests that you have and I have because we're black, supposedly, ought to motivate our union, our solidaristic efforts. Not at all. But what I'm trying to do is, how do we get at the messiness of that when a certain conception of black representation is doing all of this work to block us from getting to that? Right? So it's really fascinating. So there.
But what's that we're waiting for messiahs? That the idea of the prophet has been the prophetic as manifesting itself in a few charismatic individuals in any historical period is what is blocking this?
No. I think it's a particular. Ironically, people used to say this is a nationalistic conception of blackness, but it's not really that. It's actually a kind of black liberal conception of blackness that's doing interesting sorts of work in terms of how it's representing black political interest in light of...
But you relate that to Barack Obama's election.
Right, I did. Because I think, as I said last night, I think President Obama has mastered a wonderful wink and nod politics, where he actually activates this form of representational politics in his interest. Which then, in effect, demobilizes this community in very interesting sorts of ways when it comes to the hell that they're catching. The hell that is differentiated.
No, I'm
right? Because remember, the fire Drake has become a black bourgeois politics that now stands in for all politics as such.
But that's
and if that's the case, then your distinction gets between these two classes. It's just.
But that's putting a tremendous. That's making Barack Obama seem like a very savvy and wily kind of person. Or politician.
Perhaps.
I mean, that's a big thing to be saying.
At Harvard.
I just wanted to make sure you were saying that. In front of Charles Ogletree. Anyway, Gene Rivers.
I know Tree. Tree know I know what I'm talking about. I just can't.
Tree said no comment.
He gave me that smile. I know that smile.
Professor Glaude, a brilliant lecture. Very well done. The question I want to raise has to do with sort of challenging some of the pieties of a certain kind of romantic populist historiography.
I was waiting for this one.
Right. Of the civil rights movement that venerates Ella Baker, Bob Moses, and I want to push it a bit because Ella Baker is a daughter of the South, and like much of the civil rights movement, their understanding is shaped. And see, the one-liner is that, you know, strong people don't need strong leaders. Well, probably the reverse is true, too, that weak people do. And one of the questions I want to raise, just in terms of Baker and, you know, and the anti-elite model of populist organizing, which was predicated upon a very oversimplified political theory of classes and the role and function of elites.
Boy, Eugene, you biasing the question.
Yeah, no, I'm going there because I want the dialogue because,
okay. All right.
See, my view is that the appropriation of Baker's, you know, kind of populist vision for a historical context almost 50 years later, which is infinitely more complex, risks oversimplifying the reality. You see, and I'll end the question this way. Let's imagine taking Ella Baker, and I know, and putting her in the middle of East Baltimore on the set of The Wire, where she's having these deliberative discussions with Omar Marlowe and Stringer Bell. Very different kind of conversation. And about 10 years ago, I and some organizers who were actually building off Bob Moses helped start Bob Moses' Algebra Project. Right. We brought him into Dorchester to meet with some drug dealers. About 15 years ago, we brought Bob into the hood and say, okay, Bob, we're going to test the SNCC model, which works in Mississippi, Alabama. Let's see how this, and we brought Vincent Harding, and we brought them into the neighborhood to have a political conversation about how do you translate the rhetoric and the populism in a context which is completely different than healthy black people who are based in black churches like Fannie Lou Hamer. And what was amazing in the conversation with Vincent and Bob, those two generations talk completely past one another.
As expected.
Right? So that the model in the current context, you know, has to be much more nuanced and lacks, you know, there needs to be some Mosca, Pareto, and even the Gramsci reading needs to be refined for it to have applicability within the context of the age of The Wire, right, as opposed to Obama.
I appreciate the question. I appreciate the question. I appreciate the question, but I want to push back a little bit as you expected, right? And that is that the claim is not that the model as it was, right, ought to be brought in, and the people who enacted it ought to be brought wholesale into this moment. To ask Bob Moses to go into that side of Baltimore, to speak in the way, given his particular formation under those particular conditions, and to expect the model through his mouth to play itself out. This is not a nostalgia for that kind of politics. That's what you sort of push. No. The first two lectures I'm actually trying to hold off. They're walking around in my head, but I'm not trying to say Ella needs to be enacted as Ella Baker today. What I'm saying is that the strand of Right. No. What I was trying to do is to say she is an exemplar of prophetic pragmatism shorn of the anxieties that haunt its initial articulation. What are those anxieties? Those anxieties have every... Yeah. Right. Yeah. I'm saying that I'm reading her as an... Yeah, in English. Right. Just the... So, what's happening in these lectures, which you so acutely and in an expected way peeped, is that I'm not just simply reconstructing the prophetic and heroic. I'm trying to take prophetic pragmatism and make it my own. Right. So this is the second generation, patricide. I'm trying to make it my own. Right. So Ella Baker becomes an exemplar of prophetic pragmatism, and I said shorn of the anxiety that haunted its initial articulation. What's the anxiety? The anxiety, right, is Cornell's Kierkegaardian anxiety, right, is a kind of Kierkegaardian encounter that has him dealing with the shudder, that leads him to believe that pragmatism is anemic, which then allows the prophetic to be the supplement that will beef it up. And what does he put in it? He puts in Marxism, he puts in Chekhovian compassion, blah, blah, blah. Now, I'm trying to suggest, right, that all of this egalitarian stuff that attends the initial articulation of pragmatism actually gets overdetermined and perhaps undone by the supplement, right? Because he starts doing things, particularly the Christian component, right, that actually challenges, right, the things that he's commending in interesting sorts of ways. So Baker, for me, opens up the opportunity to pull out the democratic perfectionist strand that's in prophetic pragmatism and that's in pragmatism generally.
Who's also a Christian.
Right.
Who's also
right. Remember, I said I am too. Right? That pulls it out. See, no, let's not get it twisted. Right? Although it's complicated. Right? Right. It's complicated. So what I'm suggesting is not that we take SNCC, it's not a romantic embrace. I'm a romantic, but not a romantic embrace of what SNCC did and bring it into the moment. It is a form of organizing which cultivates the capacities of everyday ordinary people to suggest to them that if democracy is going to be robust, right, in this particular community of experience, right, we have to step up and take responsibility for the benefits and burdens of what that democracy demands of us. But the form of politics that has overdetermined African-American democratic life is one that is representational in a thick sense, precisely because of what Jim Crow and white supremacy demands. So to send Bob Moses into the hood is not the point. The point is that those of us who know the hood have to go up in there, figure out how to organize, and figure out how to make Jamal, all these cats who have amazing acumen, to figure out how to get them to see and understand their capacities to lead. I'm not denying that, though. I'm not denying that, though.
No, see, okay. No, it's more complex than that because
what's
there
the
is,
it?
No, no,
what's the it?
The proposal. In other words, you say, I'm not nostalgically pulling on this old school pastoral Southern populist thing. I'm saying that some of the principles need to be updated and improved. If I get you, right?
Okay.
Let's update it. It's not Bob Moses. We got to have a new and improved version of Bob Moses. I'm saying that their conception, their theory, the implicit theory of Ella Baker, that you don't have to have a top down,
right,
and that it can be just the people guiding. Well, no, that's not true to history. History does not support that anywhere. There's no social movement in the 20th century, or in fact, it's just not there in human history.
So me and you gonna say, so what we need to do is just bring Wolin up in this joint, drop politics and vision, because what Wolin is doing very clearly is taking this conception of the political that's rooted in the people taking responsibility, because he insists on direct democracy, right?
Yeah, well,
and the moment, but I'm saying the moment in which the people's interests are represented, according to Wolin, democratic energies are captured. So he says democracy is fugitive, it's episodic, it explodes. It's not politics. It's not politics. It's talking about political.
No. If I go into a black barbershop or a black church, I don't need Sheldon Wolin to
now you're
have
gonna
a
switch
deliberative conversation.
No, you're going to cross me over now. Obviously, I can go into a barbershop too.
I got it. So, but my point is this. I don't need to invoke Sheldon Wolin and the politics of vision, because that sounds lofty, to get the conversation around how black people, organize their interests. And where I'm pushing you is just phones. Now, what I'm suggesting is that intellectually now, we are in a crisis that is just enormously complex. We don't have the conceptual categories to really interrogate, engage this thing. And all I'm suggesting is that Ella Baker's nice, that's an important historical period. And if I read Barbara Ramsey's book, that's one take. Then there's Taylor Branch, there's David Garrow. There are a variety of takes that don't end up with the same necessary conclusions. And I'm suggesting that we need a new historiographic framework that helps us rethink how we deal with the complexity that Skip just talked about, because 90% of the political discourse in this country is not factoring in the fact that the bottom third of black America has been left to die. And we really don't know what to do with that. That's the truth. And it's not clear that a Southern theater model is appropriate to what I do in Newark, New Jersey, or Baltimore.
Oh, wow. Wow, I know we got to ask somebody else, let somebody else talk, but we do this all the time. We do this all the time. But I just want to make it very clear. Because that was an old school move. There was an old school move to go to the barbershop that was an old school move to go to the barbershop when I invoked Sheldon Wolin. Because the reason why I invoked Sheldon Wolin, I'm not talking about whether you know him or not. No, I just, you know, but the move was this. It was a response to the claim that the model, right, somehow lacked, right, well, could not be aligned to the complexity of the moment. That in some ways it had not necessarily lapsed into incoherence, but its efficacy had to be questioned because as a theory of democratic life, it falls short. That's the claim. And I said, so that's the suspicion. So the move is to suggest, because one of the moves that I'm making, which I'm very hesitant about, is to liken Baker's suspicion of representation to Wolin's suspicion of representation, to liken what SNCC took themselves to be doing to Wolin's notion of the politics of tending, which is this local politics that has something to do with the political, not with politics, right? And that distinction matters, right? So I invoke Wolin and say, well, hold up now, so let me try to extend this critique. So what you're suggesting is X, Y, and Z. I'm not invoking Wolin to authorize Ella Baker's voice. Right. What I'm actually trying to do is to bring Baker in the room to deepen the various ways in which we're thinking about political theory, right? Now, I don't think it's just simply an invocation of a strategy that was devised and developed and enacted in the context of a Southern theater. I think it's actually much more complicated than that. But we can talk about that, too. I know there's somebody else, because we're running, got 15 minutes.
We got plenty of time.
He likes this. I ain't been on the hot seat all night.
Waiting for this all week.
Great set of lectures, Eddie. I really appreciate it. I think this might be a different way of going at what Gene, I think, is pressing you on. I mean, when I hear it, and you talk about a democratic perfectionism and militant egalitarianism, and so is a kind of, I mean, you're not. So Gene is pressing you like, well, what's going to work?
Right.
Right.
And that
that's what he's pressing you, right? But
I can't settle that beforehand, though.
I'm taking you to be saying something about even like the kind of the ethics of this form of politics, like what in that places constraints on the means that are appropriate. I guess the hard part, though, is if it turns out that this kind of deliberative populism, that it either, I mean, in the extreme case, doesn't work at all. That is, in terms of like getting Black people free, or more, I put a little slightly weaker claim would be that a top-down, more elitist politics works much better, so we get there sooner. So I take I think that's what the pressure is on your position. In some ways, I felt like there was a tension between the talk of experimentalism and the talk of militant. Of kind of militant egalitarianism, because I would have thought, well, if it just turns out that you try it and top-down just works better, then we should do that. But it seemed like you want to resist it, but you didn't come out and say it. I mean, but it seemed like what you want to resist it and say something. This would be rather strong thing to say, but maybe you think it's true. That even if the top-down worked better in terms of getting us free or getting us free sooner, you still would endorse this more democratic ethos, democratic ethic, sort of on, I don't know, on a kind of moral grounds or something like that. Oh, absolutely. So that's what I mean, I take it that if you say that out straight out, if that's what you think, then that'll at least speak to what Gene is pressing you on.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah, about Moses. I mean, it's very interesting. If Moses did your son with it, in his statement at the end of lecture, was it lecture 2 when he stood up and said, I'm just going to tell you all about the historical facts. And the betrayal of our entire movement by these Negroes named Bayard Rustin, Walter Reuther, Martin Luther King, et cetera, in 1964. I mean, it was quite amazing. And I'm sitting there thinking, if I'd been there, I would have voted with them to tell her, you are not going to represent the, it's not going to work right now.
But see,
so I thought it seems like you're romanticizing this moment.
No, no.
And we can have leadership without leaders.
No. Y'all are killing me.
Professor Sullivan,
Hold up, let me try to answer Tommy's point right quick. This is really interesting. Do we have any, we should be doing an ethnography of this response. This is really, this one will make it in the book. I know, no. That's good, it's gonna make it in the book. Because Tommy, you're right? Because remember there was a moment in which I insisted that part of Baker's experimentalism is an insistence on method, right, or on process. So, and what she in some ways insisted that SNCC actually exhibit or enact in the very ways in which they organize was this kind of receptive practice where we have to kind of come in, sit down, and you had to kind of do the laborious work of organizing. And you had to do it in such a way that you didn't come in here to lead anybody. You came in here to create the conditions under which when SNCC is no longer there, these folk will lead themselves, right? And for her, this is absolutely central, right? Because if you arrive at an end otherwise, right, then you actually set them up to be duped and exploited or however, again. So if I use this example in my book, it could very well be the case that, let me say it differently, we have to cash out what does it mean for black folk to be free, right, in its details. Because it very well could be the case that freedom is that we're no longer under colonial rule, right? Hold on.
It was leadership model. He goes into organize. Ramsey Moore, the whole thing. And the assumption was, and this is articulated in the whole debates between Foreman and Bob Moses back and forth in the various factions, his model of non-leadership and that the people will lead themselves failed. Okay.
Okay. Right, we're going to get to that. There are winners and losers even among the oppressed, right? So there's a sense in which the measure could be that we're no longer under colonial rule. But the process by which that takes place doesn't exhibit the values and commitments of a democratic life, cultivating democratic positions. We could end up with, although there's no guarantee that even under the view I'm commending that this wouldn't happen, but you could end up with the person who was at once a liberator now becoming a tyrant. And in A Shade of Blue, I used the example of Mugabe in this instance. And that's a complicated story, but the point is nevertheless made. So part of what I'm insisting is that just as Dewey insists on tinkering, experimentalism, and he commends a kind of broad understanding of the scientific approach as a way to do this with regards to ethical questions. And the method becomes absolutely crucial to the ends, right? I'm suggesting that for Baker, this method is absolutely crucial for these democratic ends that she's trying to achieve, precisely because democratic perfectionism is a value, right? We want to produce contexts where these sorts of dispositions are evidenced. So it's not just simply ending Jim Crow. It's not just simply getting X person elected. It's not just simply, right, ending Sheriff Bull Connor's rule or reign, right? It's actually producing particular kinds of people, right? And so that becomes, and so if that's a value, which I believe it is, and it's a value that I think is crucial for democratic life, because again, I'm positing a robust conception of democratic individuality as crucial to vibrant democratic life. If it's a value, then how we engage in our politics, how we invoke the political to play on that distinction, right? That's an end that has to be evidenced in the very means by which we pursue other ends, if that makes sense.
Ron and BJ?
Skip, my question is structural and methodological, and since the substantive is so rich, I'm going to pass because I can talk to him separately. Yeah, at dinner. Positive. I don't want to disrupt the flow.
He's my boy, and he didn't want to come at me like that. I appreciate you, brother. That's my man. That's my man. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
I'm wondering if the debate between, as I see it, at one end, a kind of vanguardism, a kind of leaderism, a kind of, the privileged role of the talented tenth of an elite, and on the other end, a kind of the leader in every person, you know.
It's inscribed on the heart.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you know, and if in fact, and I'm prompted to pose it in this fashion because you mentioned the possibility of an ethnography of the responses you are getting here. I wonder if what we are getting is in fact not completely, you know, unsupportable in the view of revolutionary history itself, where all of these two extremes are actually never that divorced, as was presupposing them to be. That there's a constant negotiation between, because, and I think maybe, I don't know if I heard you correctly, I mean, your deployment of the concept of representation, would you please clarify that? Because there's representation in terms of party politics,
right,
in terms of citizenship, you know, rights, and there's representation in terms of activities, self-organization,
right,
you know. So I don't think these positions are that so completely divorced that you can't negotiate between them. And that at any rate, revolutionary history gives us that always, always, these positions are always reconciled and negotiated, and that's the way we can move forward.
Right.
I mean, you,
right.
and could you also clarify your conception, how you locate localism here, especially with what you call networked localism?
Right.
Because it seems to me that localism on one hand would presuppose that kind of self-activity of, you know, in the hood, and then how do you connect hoods, you know, especially because of this great class divide that now exists. How do you
yeah. I mean, a great example of network localism might be the Bloods. I just wanted to just give you an example. But part, I mean, this is, at this point in the talk, I'm putting Baker in conversation, at least in my head, with Sheldon Wolin. And I said that I didn't want to wholly assimilate her into Wolin's position. So Wolin has a deep-seated suspicion of representation, right? And how, for him, direct democracy is democracy, right? As I understand it, right? And so at the moment in which democracy is channeled into representational government or representational forms, hence the contrast in the essay in Past as Present, President's Past, you have this distinction between politics of tending and the politics of intending. And he wants to commend the politics of tending. This is this local politics that he gets, because remember, he's a close read of de Tocqueville, and as a close reader of de Tocqueville, he wants to take seriously as the heart of American life, these, not only the formation of these habits and habits of the heart, but this kind of, this local gritty political effort on the part of people where this is where democratic dispositions are actually formed, in his point, right? So he's taking that view, right? At least this is how I'm reading him. And so what I want to say that now, so I don't want to say that Baker assimilates that suspicion wholeheartedly, but she has a suspicion of a certain kind of representational model of black leadership, right? In the sense that the moment in which black interests are being represented without any means of accountability, and this is what she saw at SCLC, right? Without any means of accountability, where charisma then does work to what? Short circuit and demobilize populations, right? Remember, the worry is that King will just show up, boom, get everybody excited, have the big media event, jet, and then how were the people to be mobilized after that moment, right? After the period, right? And so there was an interesting challenge here. So part of what I'm trying to suggest is let's think about that suspicion in a sustained way. This is part of what I'm doing.
So in that respect, your project is actually far more limited and self-aware than the grandiosity which has apparently been heard.
And this is really important because there's a footnote here about the undifferentiated mass, right? Because my wife was like, you can't read all of these footnotes. I said, I know, this is for the book, right? So when I said the masses, I was thinking about Adolph Reed, right? Reed understands the term as the masses as a homogenizing mystification. He writes, quote, it is a category that has no specific referent in black institutional, organizational, or ideological life. Unlike workers, parents, the unemployed, welfare recipients, tenants, homeowners, lawyers, students, residents of a specific neighborhood, Methodists, or public employees, the term the masses does not refer to any particular social position or constituency, nor is it likely that anyone consciously identifies simply or even principally as part of this undifferentiated mass. The category assumes a generic, abstract, and thus mute referent. It therefore reproduces the non-participatory politics enacted by the mainstream black political elite. The masses do not speak, somebody speaks for them. Right? This is what I was trying to reference.
We're running out of time, but I promise this brother.
And then there are like 5 other people. We can't? All right.
I missed you yesterday, so go ahead and ask your question.
All right, I'd like to actually return to Cornel West's vision of prophetic pragmatism. Mm-hmm. For me, he adds the adjective of prophetic to pragmatism because he doesn't feel like pragmatism is enough for what he wants society to envision as a means of justice. And if you drop off the prophetic, from his pragmatism, then I think the risk is that moral imagination and populism isn't enough to achieve what Cornel wants us to embody as far as social justice. So I'm wondering, one, if you want to agree with what I just said, and I know you are pushing back against his invoking. You mainly say his Christianity, but you could also put in his Marxism and all the other stuff that you articulated. But I'm wondering if you drop off his version of prophetic and the pragmatic. Jeffrey Stout has even though he's anti-foundationalist, he basically says that there is a such thing as right. Okay. And so I feel like we kind of missed that in your conception that you have more imagination of the Tea Party versus the more imagination of the Occupy movement, and how do you rectify those two things?
You can't settle it beforehand. It has to be settled in the context of actual debate, right? And so to that extent, Jeff, in the background, Jeff's understanding of justification and the like certainly informs my work. So so it's not like this is going to be settled beforehand, right? And then we're going to work it out, and as we work it out, we're going to make our way to something in the end that can be called truth. That might be too Persian, right, Dave? But you get the point, right? In terms of Cornell's, and actually, he jettisons the word pragmatism, not prophetic, right? I think pragmatism actually has more resources than he does. I think if I read pragmatism to be much more robust, I think pragmatism has a conception of the tragic in it. He doesn't. I think pragmatism can think about the prophetic in ways that evade some of the problems that he worries about. I think there's a social theory in pragmatism that can be that can be explicated in very sophisticated and complex ways that can help us understand our moment. And more importantly, for my purposes, I think the way African Americans have taken up pragmatism explicitly offers that tradition a trajectory for understanding itself that opens up a whole new range of passive inquiry. There's an encounter between black folk and Dewey. Not that Dewey is all of that, but there's an encounter between this work and his work that inflects Dewey in ways and directions that are really fascinating. There's a strand, for example, around democracy and education that Ella Baker encounters. I've been trying to hunt it down in the archive, but she encounters it. I want to think about it in relation to how she's thinking about freedom schools and Septima Clark and these folks. Charles Johnson writes in his journal, right? I am a Deweyan, right? What does this mean? Not that I have to give Dewey the center stage, but what does it mean when these people explicitly say that they're pragmatists, and how does it play itself out in the way in which they do their work, right? If I take my mentor's tact, I got to leave pragmatism behind and go elsewhere. But if I settle down in pragmatism and think about it different, then maybe I can actually do something very different with it than has been done.
We don't have time for everyone with a question to ask questions. So
It is on. Okay.
Lord have his mercy.
So theoretically, what you're talking about is really dynamic and robust and really great. And I agree with the side that when you take this type of approach, that we can all unlock, our leadership capacities, and everybody plays their own role and stays in their own lane for the greater good. So, but what I want to try to understand is this more contemporarily, and you brought it up a little bit. How does this relate to the Occupy movement? How does it relate to? I'm the Hip Hop Archive Fellow, so I'm thinking about this in terms of this particular generation and the movements that are going on around young people and their use of new media technologies and hip hop culture. How does this relate to that? And I mean, can you break down your theory with this particular example so that I can understand it just a little bit more in a more newsworthy rather than, I mean, Ella Baker's great, I get that, but I'm trying to understand what you're talking about more practically and right now.
Okay, let me. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Taekwon Taylor. I go to the Jeremiah E. Burke High School.
It's a pleasure to meet you, black man.
And I was asking, I was wondering that if you were in Ella Baker's shoes, what would you have done about the conflict, or not a conflict, the disagreement about Martin Luther King Jr.'s perspective and how to deal with the problem in her perspectives?
That's a great question. It's a great question. So let's take them both in kind, right? There is obviously something powerful in Dr. King's witness to call us to step beyond our current selves into a way of being that's consonant with the dawning of freedom for black folks. That seems to me quite clear. And there's a role for rhetoric, for how a certain mode of speech, and I've talked with Amy Hollywood this morning about it, but how the figural generates an affect that can call action into being. So there's something that comes out of that pulpit that could do some work to move people, to risk everything. There's something about, that congregational experience that's not just simply in pews, but people working together and hearing someone that could move them to do something that they would not ordinarily do. And I think Ms. Baker, in her critique of King, sometimes lost sight of that power. But I think Dr. King also found himself in a position where the weakness of others can allow one or enable one to assume the mantle of leadership in ways that actually dwarf their capacities. Now, I'm going to say a little bit. Now, to go to this question really quickly. Part of my hesitancy to do that is that oftentimes when we clear space for folks to do the thinking together, people step in it and fill it. What this emphasis on democratic perfectionism will look like under present conditions, right, will be determined by the solidarities constituted to address the problems faced. So I can't say specifically beforehand what that means in the context of the Occupy movement. I know that there's a suspicion of top-down leadership where we see a kind of reach for democratic decision-making, a reach for democratic life. I know the way in which I try to use Twitter, which is anarchic and leveling just as a form. I'm reaching for something, right? I know what the cipher tries to achieve, right? Even as notions of excellence is being expressed in the midst of one's performance of one's mastery of craft, how that can become a space to do all sorts of things. But I don't want to say beforehand, because then I'm actually engaged in a performative contradiction.
Let's thank Eddie.